Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really fascinating and maybe surprising chapter of Arad's history. We're looking at its former entertainment district and, specifically the red light district that used to be there. Our plan is to sort of piece together local memories and historical context to, well, try and understand this world that's vanished.
Yeah, and I think it's really important right from the start to say this is historical exploration. We're looking back at how things actually were in Arad, trying to get it in its own time, you know,
Right.
not judging it by today's standards.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've got quite a mix of sources. There are these personal accounts, really valuable, recorded by Pushkal Peter, and then glimpses from old Arad newspapers, too. It's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Trying to fit potentially biased memories together with, whatever official records exist.
That's spot on. And that's kind of the mission here, to dig up this hidden layer of Arad's story. We want to find those surprising details about ordinary people's lives, the social norms back then, really get beyond just the buildings, because honestly, a lot of them aren't even there anymore.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where exactly are we talking about? It sounds like the old fish market area, Heimdmukke Square now, and the streets around it were like the main zone.
That's right, yeah, the historical heart of it. What's kind of sad, though, is how many of the old buildings there have just disappeared. Despite some talk about preservation, a lot of important houses around what they called Ovarter, that's before 1920 got knocked down, and replaced with newer stuff that doesn't really fit the historical vibe.
Such a shame, isn't it? A real loss of that architectural history. Our sources mention specific places now gone, like the Stadtwien Hotel. And this house at Heimdemoko Square number 1, apparently known as the Turkish House, from 1825. Wow. Even places still standing, like the Golden ABC or the Red Bull Inn, are described as, well, almost unrecognizable now, neglected. Losing the Stadtwien, that must have really changed the look of the place. But thinking beyond the bricks and mortar, what was life like inside those walls? What kind of interactions?
Well, what's interesting is the contrast. While the buildings themselves have often decayed, the actual infrastructure, nearby roads, utilities, has seen upgrades. But the exceptions kind of prove the rule, like the old train and bridge, crucial for transport, and the Preparandia building, which thankfully did get restored eventually. They stand out against the general neglect of the actual historic buildings.
So a real mixed bag on the preservation front. But we shouldn't forget how much history was packed in there. We still
Mhm.
have some incredible survivors, as the sources point out. The oldest stone theater in Romania from 1817, the Preparandia from 1812, the first Romanian school in Transylvania. That's huge. The Damjanich House, the Nilog Synagogue, and that weirdly named Padlock House, important for manufacturing history.
Absolutely. Right, so let's talk about this idea of an entertainment district. The sources really paint a picture, don't they? Inns, basic hotels, pubs, and yeah, brothels all crammed together. And that whole social scene, it's just gone, vanished.
And you can feel it's still a bit of a sensitive topic even now. The sources suggest it's mostly talked about privately, kind of whispered memories. But it was definitely part of the city back then, affecting all sorts of people, intellectuals, travelers, soldiers, you name it. Do you think that lingering taboo has actually messed with the historical record? Like, are we missing voices because people were reluctant to talk?
That's a really good question. It's very likely, yeah. The reluctance probably means fewer official documents and more reliance on these personal stories, which are great, but harder to, verify sometimes. But connecting this to the bigger picture, this district wasn't just about the transactions. It actually influenced artists. The poet Imre Horvath, he was a journalist in Arad in the 30s, apparently hung out there a lot. He even hinted at it in his poem Elegia from Arad. And way earlier, Adi Andre, huge name in Hungarian literature, was known to visit local taverns with scantily clad ladies, as they put it, almost like a hidden inspiration for some of them.
It is, but the challenge now is figuring out what's accurate. Memories fade, they get mixed up. And like the source says, by the 1980s, the actual places, restaurants, baths, brothels were mostly gone. Which makes you wonder, how do you rebuild that past when the physical clues disappear and the stories don't always match up? Still, some of those unofficial names for the brothels have survived, passed down orally. They give us a little insight into how people saw them.
Oh yeah, tell me. Like tsutkas, meaning with a loaf, which apparently meant it was, cheaper. Then tukros, with mirrors. Emeliks, with a floor. Pretty straightforward bruslampas, with a red lamp, obviously.
Huh.
And tisti, or official, seen as more upmarket. These names seem to date back before World War I. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how these simple names loaf, mirrors, hint at the quality, the clientele, It wasn't just one thing. There was a kind of social ladder even in this hidden world.
Absolutely. And then there's the House of the Rooster, the Caxasas, early 20th century, run by Tanti Feher. The detail about her husband Arthur being a gambler just adds a bit of color, doesn't it? And Mr. Kovac's Abadzia restaurant, supposedly linked to brothel money. But the Kovacs family also left something more permanent, that beautiful Art Nouveau palace on Milea Avenue. It's funny how these different parts of life were all tangled up.
It really shows how connected things were in that community. And we can't forget the Vilaili Bar, described as the busiest nightclub around, mostly because it was cheap. And its location, right opposite a really popular brothel near the fish market, definitely helped its business. Makes sense, a convenient stop before or after.
Okay, now the vase, public baths near the Padlock House, sound interesting. Not fancy, but the newspaper ads talking about refreshed staff,
Wow.
that's pretty blatant code for new girls arriving.
Oh, completely. Everyone knew what that meant. These young women could be requested in basic private rooms. You could rent them by the hour. Didn't even have to take a bath. It just really highlights the double purpose of some places in the district.
Right. Let's look at some numbers quickly. Comparing Arad to other Transylvanian cities around World War I, it seems Arad had fewer places, but they were still there.
Yeah, the figures we have suggest that while cities like Cluj, Oradea, Timisoara had more official brothels and registered women, Arad still had about 7 places, with around 48 women listed. And crucially, those numbers don't include the independent women working outside the system.
And it looks like things shifted after World War I. Arad became less of a hub for these houses of tolerance compared to towns in Moldova in the 30s.
That's right. Places like Brozila and Bacău had way more brothels listed then. Although, interestingly, the sources say a lot of people from Moldova still preferred coming to Transylvanian cities, probably hoping to earn more. It kind of shows you the internal migration and the economic drivers behind this hidden economy.
Fascinating how even this is tied to bigger economic trends. Okay, let's get into the rules, the regulations. It sounds like there was actually a surprisingly detailed system for prostitution in historical Hungary after 1867, and then in Romania after 1899. So it wasn't just a free-for-all. The authorities were trying to manage it, for better or worse.
Absolutely. It was officially regulated, supervised. There were laws covering the rights and duties of the matrons and the prostitutes. These rules were even written down in things called kondici and put up on the walls inside the houses. Like, the women had the right to refuse clients if they looked like they had an STD and they couldn't work during their period.
So some basic protections built in. It's interesting that Szeged and Cluj were apparently pioneers in regulating this in historical Hungary. They set the pattern.
They did. And the rules tended to be pretty similar everywhere, focused on who could run a brothel, usually women over 30 as matrons, and they categorized the women, brothel girls, those working privately, and these trailers, which probably meant women who moved around or didn't have a fixed base. But universally, no girls under 17, no one with a criminal record, no one with STIs.
And it seems public health was a big concern. Mandatory police registration, regular medical checks. That started in Romania in the 1920s.
Yes, first monthly, then later even more often every 2 weeks, sometimes weekly. Here in Arad, apparently the dermatologist would even visit the women personally, and the results went on a red form, checked by the city's head doctor. Later, it became a more formal medical sheet.
Quite a system. But the actual legal definition of prostitution in Romanian law sounds like it was a bit fuzzy.
It was pretty vague, yeah. What exactly counted as prostitution? Who was legally responsible? It wasn't super clear. Then in 1936, they technically made it illegal, but the sources suggest everyone pretty much ignored that ban in practice.
Maybe helped by the rumors about King Charles II himself. The source mentions him visiting certain streets in Bucharest often. That definitely complicates things.
Funny enough, during World War II, the term brothel owner actually reappeared officially in 1943. They got some freedom to operate again, but they weren't allowed to hang around outside the premises. No loitering.
Yeah. And here's a really weird detail. A mandatory savings card for the prostitutes. They had to save 10% of their daily earnings, supposedly for their future, but sounds like it was easy to get around. It just shows the gap between the official rules and what actually happened.
It really does. And the figures on what the women earned are all over the place. But one source from 1944 suggests a popular woman could make way more in one night than the average person's monthly salary. Puts it in perspective.
It really does. Though, as the source points out, the women themselves often only kept less than half of that. Now, that red lantern, why red? Any solid theories?
It's a bit murky, actually, which adds to the whole mystique. One idea links it to railway workers. Apparently, they'd leave their red signal lanterns by the door so they could grab them easily later. A practical thought.
Okay, that makes sense. And there's also something about a Chinese custom using red paper lamps at similar places, so maybe multiple origins or just a symbol everyone understood.
Right.
What about the women themselves, the girls of air? What were they generally like based on these accounts?
Well, the general feeling you get from the memories is that they weren't always super young or, conventionally beautiful by everyone's standards. A lot seemed to come from the countryside, maybe after losing jobs as maids and feeling like they couldn't go back home. For others, it was probably a way to make more money than they could otherwise. And maybe, for some, the idea of city life, the sort of perceived glamour of being a mistress, had some appeal. But the reality was likely much tougher.
That story about the high school kid's initiation and then him painting an election sign in a brothel yard in 46, that's quite something. Especially since teenagers weren't legally allowed in, though it sounds like it was pretty common for young guys getting ready for marriage to visit these places. The source mentions that many of the women were actually quite sympathetic towards inexperienced young men. There were even these pedagogue ladies who'd sort of guide the newbies. It paints a more complex picture than just pure exploitation.
It really does. That memory from the visitor who found comfort in their sympathy even though he had no money, that really sticks with you. And the story about the hospital painter helping with the medical checks and getting offered free services, that's definitely memorable.
Then there's the 92-year-old dental technician who treated many of them in the 30s. He remembered most were Hungarian and, surprisingly, really careful about their teeth. It's these little human details, isn't it, that make it feel real.
Totally. The source also describes how the red house itself was set up compared to this unmarked building next door. That was used as a kind of semi-official meeting place in the late 30s where the women actually rented rooms somewhere else. It suggests maybe a bit more discretion trying to work around the rules.
Okay, let's talk money, the economics of affordable love. Sounds like Arad was different from places like Montinia in how payment worked.
Yeah, generally in Arad, the clients paid the women directly. Not like in Montinia where the matron controlled all the money. Here, the matron's job was more about running the place, greeting clients, showing them the options. You could pick from a photo album, describe what you wanted, or if you were regular, just ask for someone by name.
And definitely a price range. Kudikas was the cheapest for apprentices and such. Tisti was pricier. The source mentioned something like 50 lei for a top service at Tisti, maybe half that at the cheaper spots. And there were even couplers, middlemen with their own slang. It really was a whole subculture, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. That story about the army recruits who first wanted to beat the girls just to get warm, but ended up paying at Veely's bar. It shows how people understood these places had a specific function. It does. And people tried to cheat the system, too, like that Mr. Yazzie, who tried declaring bankruptcy in 1928. But the women just moved to the place next door.
Huh. Resourceful. And the prefect of Arad tried to step in 1929, stopping matrons from forcing the women to buy marked-up goods. But of course, the matrons found other ways, giving loans, selling cosmetics to keep the women dependent. The financial setup involved splitting earnings, deductions for room and board, and the description of the rooms themselves. Pretty grim. Basic iron bed, wobbly chair, wash basin. Not exactly luxury.
Definitely not. Better places might have had a small cabin, maybe some disinfectant. But yeah, generally quite shabby. The source also mentioned some sensational stories hitting the local papers now and then. Drunks were definitely not popular. Yes, and that rare case of a pimp getting murdered because he couldn't protect one of the women caused quite a stir. There were rules, too, like the women weren't supposed to meet clients outside the brothel. Safety reasons, probably. That story about the famous doctor's wife secretly working as a prostitute in Arad? Probably fiction, but it's amusing, adds a bit of local gossip.
And Veely's bar keeps popping up as the central point. A place to go before heading to the brothels or a late-night spot after the theater or cafes closed. That big circuit of the bachelor journalists gives you a real sense of the nightlife route back then.
And discretion was absolutely key for the women. If they acknowledged a client in public, they could be fired instantly. Plus, the regular medical checks and police oversight were always there, trying to keep STDs under control. That anecdote about the group medical visits and the rooster crowing signal, it's funny, but also kind of sad, highlighting how society pretended not to know what was going on. Later on, it shifted to individual doctor visits, often to Dr. Tesik, the dermatologist, just before WWII.
Right, so then came the end of this whole era. Public houses officially banned across Romania in 1948, Arad included. Although there had been earlier laws, they were often, let's say, loosely enforced.
It's ironic, isn't it? Even King Charles II, who supposedly frequented these places, oversaw some of those earlier decrees. But yeah, 1948 was the big change. Still, as the source notes, prostitution didn't just evaporate overnight.
No, exactly. Other ways existed even before the ban, like restaurants near the station that led to cheap rooms, high-end prostitutes in the big hotels, and women working the streets.
And we shouldn't forget the erotic press that existed back then, really pushing boundaries. Arad even had its own magazine for a bit, Black Cat.
Tivadar Fekete tried to make it a sort of bourgeois erotic satire, apparently. Even got known writers involved. Didn't last long, though.
No, the one from Timisoara, Caviar, lasted longer. And that connection with Laszlo Rethyi, the archaeologist writing dirty poems under a fake name,
Right.
and his link to Arad, it just adds another strange layer to the city's cultural life back then.
So after 1948, when the Red Lantern houses were shut down, what happened to the women? Where did they go?
It was really varied. A lot just went back where they came from, trying to put distance between themselves and that life. Under the new People's Democracy, many ended up as factory workers. There were even attempts at re-education.
Yeah.
Some managed to get jobs in the new cafes and espresso bars that were opening up.
And the lucky ones, as the source calls them, got married and just tried to keep their past hidden. But it also mentions some kept working illegally. They might face retraining or end up as informants for the authorities. Rossi the Explosive ending up in the trade union movement. That's quite a turn. It shows how adaptable people had to be.
Definitely. And some who had particular skills were apparently used by the security forces for intelligence gathering. The source suggests any women from that era still alive today are probably elderly, respectable grandmothers now. Yeah, very unlikely to talk about it. And then there's that whole other category later on under state socialism, the women of trust, who accompanied officials, often with fake public jobs as cover. A darker side.
It's such a complex, hidden history, and even though the UN banned trafficking back in '55, the debate about legalizing prostitution itself just keeps going around the world, doesn't it? Finally, let's come back to Viley's bar. It really sounds like, maybe more than the brothels themselves, this cheap local place was the true social heart of that old town area.
Yeah, according to the stories passed down, it really was. Vilmos Rosenfeld Viley ran the bar, La Viley. Apparently, it started with a decent reputation, then became this regular spot for artists, journalists. Even the composer George Enescu supposedly went there. The draw was homemade food, cheap prices, live music. Sounds like a properly lively place.
And being the lunch spot for the nearby prostitutes just cemented its role as this kind of antechamber to the lantern houses.
Exactly. Viley tried running the old Abazia restaurant later, during the war, but didn't work out so well. He ended up emigrating to Israel after everything was nationalized. His daughter's story about people eating and drinking on credit suggests maybe his generosity didn't help his finances. He was known for being hospitable, helping people out.
So when you pull it all together, these places, the stories, the people, it paints this really colorful picture of Arad's past. Maybe not always glamorous, but definitely relatable. And it goes way beyond just the big monuments and official histories. This deep dive really has uncovered a hidden side of Arad, hasn't it? Showing the complex web of life in that old entertainment district, the people involved, and how that world eventually just faded away.
It absolutely underlines why digging into these personal stories, these local memories, is so valuable. It gives you a much richer, fuller sense of the past than just dates and buildings.
And maybe it leaves us, and you listening, with this thought. We see debates about morality, about regulation come and go in cycles, right? How might these stories, these experiences from Arad's past, maybe give us a different perspective on similar conversations happening today?